Welcome to the Good Fit Careers podcast, where we explore perspectives on work that fits. I'm Ryan Dickerson, your host. Today's guest is Jennifer Adkins. Jennifer is a data scientist with Microsoft working on the search relevance and A/B experimentation. Recently, she started contributing to search within Microsoft's CoPilot AI companion platform. Microsoft, for context, generates $212 billion in annual revenue with 221,000 employees. Microsoft is currently ranked number 13 on the Fortune 500 list. Jennifer started her career as a statistical specialist with a popular convenience store chain, then joined SAS, a leading analytics software company where she worked for 9 years. Over the course of those 9 years, she was promoted several times, earning her way up to senior data scientist within the marketing sciences team. In 2022, Jennifer joined Microsoft. Jennifer, thank you for being here.
Of course. Yeah, happy to be here.
So your work in general, I find super fascinating. Having watched your career and seen you grow into your role at Microsoft, I'd love for you to start by describing just a little bit about what you do today and kind of how you see your work.
Sure. So like you mentioned, I started at Microsoft in 2022. I was hired into the search relevance organization, which, for context, if you're using any Microsoft 365 product and you're searching for something, so Outlook, for example, if you're searching for your email, our charter is to make that process easier, to make sure you're finding the emails you're looking for quickly, to make sure you're not getting, no results pages, things like that. We try to minimize those kinds of things. So working on just making that process of finding your stuff easier within Microsoft products. So it's evolved a little bit, like you said, with the advent of CoPilot, where I still work on search relevance and A/B experimentation for search, but now I've added kind of another hat to my repertoire where I'm assessing the quality of CoPilot. So when users search for things within CoPilot, what's that interaction between search and what users are looking for? So I have a dashboard that I maintain where we kind of keep track of metadata about those CoPilot interactions and try to find insights and help executives make better decisions.
That makes a lot of sense. Going back to the beginning, would you tell us a little bit about what you were like as a kid and walk us through what you wanted to be when you grew up?
I guess I shouldn't say was, but I was a big nerd. I still am. I was one of those like teacher's pet kind of kids, rule followers. That was me. Growing up, my parents always encouraged my siblings and I to figure out what your favorite subject is and kind of follow that. And so that was kind of it wasn't like pick a career or pick a road like that, but follow your favorite subject and you'll figure out what you want to do from there. Growing up, I was always really good at math, and I kind of took all of those like more advanced math courses, even at a young age. Even in elementary school, I remember taking the higher math classes. I grew up in North Florida, and for most of my childhood, took a lot of AP classes in high school. I tried International Baccalaureate for a couple of years, but it wasn't for me. So went the AP route ultimately, and kind of finished high school there.
Sounds good. And then, how did you figure out what college was going to look like? Which college you were going to go to? What you were going to focus on? What was that process like?
Yeah, I only applied to one. I grew
brave.
up. I grew up. My mom went to Florida State, and so I grew up a Florida State fan. We went to one Florida State game every single year. It was always the Duke game because we knew we would win. So she always wanted us to go to a game we knew we would win. And so when I got to the end of high school, I kind of knew that was the only place I wanted to go. In retrospect, going into math at Florida State, like there were probably better options I could have chose, but I made it work. So I applied to Florida State, got in. In Florida, we had the Bright Futures. I think it still exists, Bright Futures Scholarship, where if you've earned a certain GPA and done a few other things, you get your tuition covered. So there really wasn't any discussion of going out of state or anything like that. So for me, there was one school I wanted to go to. So I went to Florida State. I went with the intention of studying math and realized like on orientation day that I was the only person that had registered to major in math. The only person.
The only person?
And I actually, the only person on my orientation day. Yeah. And I actually ended up getting lost because I misheard the directions and thought, like, I went with the math education people, which was in a different place. So yeah, it was a whole thing that first day. So I was in a math major for a little while. I realized pretty quickly that pure math for me didn't make a lot of sense. I knew I didn't want to be a professor. I knew I didn't want to teach it. And so it was kind of like, math is great, but what do you do with it? Like, what am I going to do with it? I wanted to apply it. And so I started to look at like, okay, how could I apply math? Like, how could I use math to do something else maybe? So I switched to psychology for a little while, thinking like maybe I could do research, something like that. And then ultimately I found statistics. And it was like that, to me, I've described to people is math with a purpose. It's like math where you're doing something with it. Like you're using it to explain things. I ended up there. It's still a pretty small program at Florida State, obviously. I was one of 2 people that graduated with a stats degree.
Doubling the team.
Graduation. Yeah. So it was always like really small classes. Most of the people in my classes were pursuing another major and just had to take statistics. So it was a pretty small group of us, but had a lot of great professors, learned a lot, obviously. But when I finished at Florida State, I kind of knew that I needed to go to grad school. And I knew that was kind of the next natural step. There, I did end up applying for more than one school. So I
Good for you. Way
broadened
to go.
broadened my options a little bit. I applied to 5. And I got into both North Carolina State and Florida State. So those were kind of my 2 that I had to choose between. North Carolina State, at the time, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but was one of the top 5 programs for statistics in the country.
Nice. Right on.
So it was definitely something I was interested in. I actually did, going back a second, between my junior and senior year at Florida State, I did, continuing with the nerd theme, I did a summer camp essentially for people that are interested in biostatistics. And it was at NC State. Yeah. So it was like you had an opportunity to meet a lot of different people, I had exposure to things like the Duke Clinical Research Institute, to different schools in North Carolina that were doing biostats related things. So that was kind of where like I knew I liked North Carolina. I liked NC State. I liked the vibe there. It was very similar to FSU in kind of the culture. So that's kind of where I ended up.
How interesting. What a neat summer program. That sounds like a fascinating one.
That's not usually the reaction I get when I tell people I did a summer camp in biostatistics.
Did you research anything interesting? Did you study anything cool during that summer?
It was a lot. It was the reason I went into biostatistics as a grad degree, that we did a lot of like clinical trials research. We went and toured like GlaxoSmithKline and learned about their like clinical research and pharmaceutical research. And it was just like, man, you could use, that was when I really, like I said, I knew statistics was math with a purpose, but it was like, this is like math that helps people. Math that like improves quality of life, that, like does all of these things that you could really make a difference.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a beautiful segue into how you landed your first job and what that was actually like. You want to tell us about it?
Yeah, I didn't go into biostatistics. So I actually, just to back up one second, so I was on a PhD track at NC State, and I got about 2 years in, and I took the qualifiers. You had to kind of do 2 years, you got your master's, and then you took qualifiers to keep going. I didn't pass at the PhD level, and it was kind of my first experience with like, yeesh, like maybe this isn't, like that's not for me, like maybe I'm not cut out for this. And that's when I had to take a hard look and say like, what would a PhD give me that a master's can't in my goals, like in what I want to do in my life? And I ultimately decided to leave with my master's. I didn't keep going, and no regrets at this point in my life. It's been 12, 15 years. So I don't have any regrets from that, but it was tough to kind of,
I bet that was a hard moment.
It was. Yeah. I had a lot of really great professors at NC State that I sat down with and had to ask them like, what would you do if you were me? Would you keep, hammering this? Would you keep trying to be more? And I knew it would mean trying to be more of a theoretical statistician than I wanted to be. Like I had to really want to, that's when I learned with PhDs, you have to really want to like crawl into that subject, learn everything about it, really understand it top to bottom. And I kind of just wanted to learn what I needed to know and go start using it.
Yeah, the practical
side. I didn't
side.
really want to, I wanted to be more applied. I wanted to take what I had learned and apply it, not keep learning about it. Like that just didn't interest me. And that's when I kind of had to, but I wanted to be Dr. Dice or Dr. Adkins, I wanted to do that thing. So it was, that was tough. That was a tough period of my life.
Could you educate me just a little bit on what theoretical statistics might be? I feel like I've got this like quantum physics kind of like visualization going on here, but what does that actually mean?
In statistics, there are kind of two camps, or the frequentists and the Bayesian statisticians. And so it comes down to, do you think that things have a preordained distribution, or do you think that things are more random? And so really kind of taking that and going even further, are just models. I didn't pursue it, so I can't talk like a ton about it. I took what I needed to know and left. But I have friends that kept going, and they were there for 3, 4, 5 years, still just kind of digging around in models and code and numbers. And I was off making money.
Right on. Good for you.
That's what I wanted to go do. So, and someone gave me the advice that a master's plus 5 years of work experience, at least in my field, is kind of equivalent to a Ph.D. And so if I wanted to just go ahead and go start getting that work experience, I would get there. I would get to where those people were that were still going.
Totally. And look where you are now.
Yeah. Like I said, no regrets.
Yeah. All right. So you moved from the master's degree into the workforce. What was that transition like? How did you land that first job?
It was a quick transition. I remember I graduated on Saturday and started my job on Monday. So it was,
wow.
There was
good for
time
you.
in between.
Nice.
Yeah, I couldn't. I was on scholarships and loans, so I had to go, start working and making money. Making real money, not teaching assistant money.
Yeah, of course. And did this job just like magically appear?
No. So I had 2 job offers coming out of my master's degree. One was from a company that I had done an internship with. And I did an internship kind of between my first and second year of my master's degree. It was with a marketing agency in Greensboro. And so I did that internship. I loved the company. It was a really small company with great people. And so they offered me a full-time job, but it would have meant moving to Greensboro. And that was something I wasn't, like Greensboro, North Carolina. So that wasn't something I was super interested in, but I appreciated that as like kind of a backup plan. But then I honestly don't remember how I found my job at Kangaroo, I think I applied and I went through the hiring process. They were I was the first, me and my manager were the first of the statistical specialists. They were kind of creating this statistical specialist org. 2 people doesn't make an org, but small but mighty.
Right on. And just like the statistics program. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, exactly. So I remember the hiring process being a heck of a lot easier than it is these days. That I just kind of went and I had a couple of interviews and I met a few people and got a job offer. And I didn't really know much about what master's level statisticians made. So I think I undervalued myself a bit at the time. So pro tip, don't do that. But I made up for it eventually. But yeah, I needed a job and it sounded interesting and I was ready to go learn about gas stations.
And so you became a statistical specialist with Kangaroo Express, which is now Circle K, right?
Correct. Yep. Yeah, they got acquired right after I left.
Right on. And what was the job like? Where did you fit within the organization?
So I was in the fuel pricing division. I actually learned a ton about gas stations, which I have a lot of trivia about gas stations now.
Yeah, right on. I'd love for you to share some of that later on.
Yeah. I was in fuel pricing. So the team I worked on, if I recall correctly, gas prices changed 4 times a day. And so we would keep track of those prices, and they change with respect to obviously cost of the fuel, but also what your competitors are doing. So there's this kind of threshold where you're trying to match or beat, but not gouge. Like there's a real fine line between profitability and price gouging. So we would kind of monitor those prices, change those prices, adjust them. Yeah, kind of keep track of how sales are responding to that.
What's your gas station trivia?
So I learned that 70% of your profit is made inside the store, not outside the store.
So the snacks and the drinks, that's the play.
Snacks, the drinks, the newspapers, the coffee. Yeah, that's where convenience stores make their money. They make like pennies on the gallon gas wise, but yeah, the margins are much higher inside the store.
How do you pick which gas station you get your gas at these days? If you are still getting gas?
We're not. Yeah, we're electric car people.
Oh, geez. You're in the future. Good for you.
Yeah, I don't have to choose. Yeah, we only have one car and it's an electric. So
good for you.
I don't
right
have
on.
to choose. Yeah.
So you're in the workforce. You finished your master's degree. You are ensuring that you're threading the needle on those like 4 time per day price changes. You're monitoring your competitors. You're monitoring, I'm assuming, crude or gasoline prices more broadly.
Yep. All day long. Yep.
What did you learn about yourself in this first job now that you're out there and like using science for practical purposes, your statistics for practical purposes?
Sure. Yeah, I learned a lot about working with people and kind of, I mean, obviously it was my first like real job. You know, I had an internship and I had done things like that, but I had never worked at a publicly traded company. I had never worked with like this many people. And I really came to quickly not love the publicly traded company part of it, that it just felt like I don't see this as much at Microsoft for obvious reasons, but Kangaroo, at least, it felt like every quarter we'd like celebrate for 10 seconds and then it'd be like, but next quarter we got to do better, you know, and it's just like was never enough. So I didn't,
it's quite a grind.
Yeah, I didn't love that just like, you know, highs and lows aspect of it. But I met a lot of really, really great, really hardworking people. I learned you can't say everything that you think. You know, I remember a specific instance where we had like an organizational meeting and we were kind of hearing from each aspect of fuel pricing. And I don't remember what all of them were, but I was one part of that kind of fuels org. And I remember saying to the VP of fuels, you know, if any of these other divisions within fuels ever need help, I'm happy to kind of contribute my talents and kind of help there. And I thought, you know, I'm just being helpful and like, yeah, you know, I know how to do stuff. And he told my boss, she clearly doesn't have enough work to do. And it was like, I did not even anticipate that that's how you could read that. But looking back, I can
that olive branch was swatted away pretty quick.
It really was. It really was like turned back at me.
Wow.
So yeah.
Brutal.
So things like that. Yeah. I kind of learned like, okay, you can't, like I said, you can't say everything you think.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And so from there, you joined SAS. And just for the world out there, would you tell us a little bit about what SAS does, how most analysts might be aware of the SAS platform?
Yeah, sure. And so I guess it requires me to go back just a little bit to being in the stats program at NC State. SAS is like indoctrinated into you. Like the building I was in was SAS Hall. Everything is SAS. Yeah. The founder and CEO of SAS went to NC State. He developed it at NC State. It's all very intertwined.
Sure.
I learned SAS coding language at NC State. And so that was always like the dream. That was kind of like, I really wanted to get to SAS. So kind of going through that program, that was always my goal. Throughout my time at Kangaroo, I was applying for jobs at SAS because that's just what I wanted to do. But I had to take that turn first. So SAS is a statistical analytics software company. That's what it used to stand for, but it doesn't anymore. It's in Cary, North Carolina, so like kind of right outside of Raleigh. And it's got, last I checked, like 12,000 people at it. There's obviously like software sales, consulting, kind of all those different organizations there. So I was hired in the consulting division. I was hired to be an analytical consultant. Analytical consultants at the time were kind of attached to products. And so I was consulting for a particular product that had to do with revenue management and pricing for hospitality companies, which ultimately meant hotels because airlines kind of do it their own way. So I did hotels, I did cruise lines, which you could argue is kind of like a floating hotel. And so we kind of treated it similarly, So that's what I was doing. I worked with a couple of really interesting companies when I started out, and I did that for about 2 years. And the product I was working on was sunsetted. So then I was kind of reorged to something else. And I didn't love consulting. I didn't love travel. I didn't love working with customers. It just like, there are people out there that do, and I was not one of them. So
when you're thinking about the evolution there, it was 9 years or so. You got promoted several times. Was there a role within that trajectory that you felt like you really hit your stride, or you like loved the work, or you had known that it was like, this is a good fit for me?
I think when I left consulting, I went to marketing, and I had never considered, I think I mentioned I did that internship in my master's program at a marketing agency. After that, I never really thought about working in marketing again, and certainly not at a tech company. When I decided to leave consulting, there was an opening for a market research data scientist. And so I applied. I liked the team. It was something totally different. And it was more, I looked at it as more internal consulting. I was kind of doing that consulting and doing that analysis, but all in-house. And so I didn't have to do any travel, and I didn't have to do any of that customer work. So I really enjoyed it. It was totally different than anything I had ever done. It was a lot of like survey research. That's when I really started getting into dashboard building and kind of creating those visualizations. And that kind of unlocked, like, if you can make things attractive and understandable, it goes a long way.
Sure. When you're thinking about kind of the things that you had to begin to master, right? It sounds like there was a little bit of diplomacy that you had to learn within the very first job. Then, stumbled into marketing or got reorged into marketing. It's like, oh, cool. This is interesting. This is a good fit for me. What were some of the things that you had to learn or had to refine your skills at to become like really proficient at that work?
It's a lot of the typical things. So the programming, the data analysis, the different types of tests and things. I had to learn that to an extent. I also had to learn that a lot of what I learned in my master's degree is not super applicable in business. You kind of have to scale it back.
Makes sense.
You just do relatively basic things, but explain them in such a way that is applicable and useful. And I think that's the bigger part. That like you can learn the programming, you can learn how to create a really great chart, but if you don't know how to explain why that somebody should care about it, then it's just a chart. It's just a bunch of bars. And if you make the wrong chart, if you're making a pie chart when it doesn't add up to 100, like that's
awkward.
That's the wrong chart.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that being able to explain your work and make it applicable and make somebody care, to me, is the bigger part. And that's when people ask me for advice in this field, that's what I always tell them. It's communication is I think the bigger part of it.
Before we move on to Microsoft, can you educate us a little bit or walk us through an example of how you might have used the SaaS platform, the SaaS products, the software that we're describing here in like a real client scenario, and maybe like what sort of problem any of your marketing clientele were trying to solve? Or like even if it was an internal client for marketing, how did you use SaaS, and how would we think about what someone in your role would do?
So a lot of what I did as part of the market research org before, so I worked in market research and then I was reorged to marketing sciences, but market research is probably the better example of this so for example, there was a time period where each of us on the market research team was assigned to like a different group within the company. And so I worked with internal communications, for an example. And so I was assigned to help them with any kind of research they were doing, whether that was survey or like real research, where I was like looking stuff up for them or whatever. But the internal comms team wanted to do like a survey of the whole company and ask them about kind of their preferences for how they get information. And so I designed the survey, I fielded the survey for them, and then gathered the results. And I used SaaS products to analyze those results. I used our dashboarding tool to build a dashboard for them where they could go in and slice and dice it themselves. And so that's where I kind of knew the whole suite front to back of like, I could do the programming because SaaS is a language, but we also have a lot of point and click tools like the dashboarding tools where I could kind of do that as well. So
Interesting. Was there, I'm sorry to dig deeper on this one, but was there perhaps like an example where you had an aha moment, or you were able to see some sort of insight that made a huge difference for the company?
One of the big projects I worked on when I was in market research was our customer satisfaction survey. And so twice a year, we'd send it to all of our customers, get a bunch of data back from them, and kind of we'd always come up with 3 to 5 nuggets of like, if we made this small change, we could see this benefit. If we made this small change, we'd see this benefit. Really kept track of net promoter score, things like that to kind of make the business better from that perspective. So there were always really interesting insights that we would find. I don't recall a lot of them specifically. That is where I learned about the differences in cultures and how they interpret things like like the Net Promoter Score question, which is how likely are you to recommend SaaS to a friend or colleague. And I learned that there are some cultures around the world that are just never going to give you a 10. Like it's just not going to happen. And so you
tough.
kind of have to manage your expectations with some of those cultures that, they're like, if they give you an 8, that really does, it means a 10 to them. But, you kind of have to accept that particular country or region is going to be lower.
Bring us along to Microsoft. You've been there for a couple of years now. Would you walk us through kind of how you actually found and landed that job, and then tell us a little bit about what you do now?
Honestly, the pandemic changed a lot for me in terms of perspective about my job. I always thought, I've 7 or 8 of the 9 years I was at SaaS, I was an in the office everyday person. And I thought I would hate working from home. I thought, I would get distracted and I would, miss a lot of the things about going into an office. And the pandemic forced me to work from home. And it turns out I don't hate it as much as I thought.
Not so bad,
I am more productive here. Yeah. There are still some aspects about working in an office that I miss, but it kind of opened up this whole new world of like, I don't have to work at a company in Raleigh or Cary or Durham or whatever. I don't have to live in Raleigh or Cary or Durham and, work at a place there. So I had never considered applying for remote jobs. And then I got to a point at SaaS where I had peaked. I just kind of felt like I got to that point where I knew what people were going to ask me before they asked me. I knew, I kind of had my Rolodex of email responses, and I was kind of coasting. And I read somewhere that if you're not uncomfortable, you're not growing. And I thought, I am pretty darn comfortable. So it's probably time to make myself a little uncomfortable. And I don't know why I targeted, the larger tech, the blue chip companies, but I just kind of thought, why not try? I've done this. I'm doing data science here at SaaS. Why not try to just like get in somewhere like Microsoft? And yeah, I applied for a bunch of jobs. The hiring process was long, but I got the job, and so far so good. Yeah.
Without going into, I guess, anything confidential or things that Microsoft wouldn't want you to share, can you tell us a little bit about what the actual interview journey was like? Was it a phone call and then you got a job? Was it several steps? What did that actually look like?
Yeah, I had obviously a phone call with a recruiter, and then I had a tech screening where I had to code in front of someone. I had to it was like a screen sharing vibe. And I've had to do that at a couple of companies that I interviewed with. So I don't think that's unique to Microsoft. I think that's pretty typical, but nonetheless brutal, especially for somebody that like I mentioned, I was at SaaS. We had our own programming language. I was an expert at SaaS, but that does not do you very much at a company that doesn't use SaaS. So I had been starting to learn Python, but it's hard to, at least for me, it's hard to learn something when I'm not using it. I was kind of taking the classes and doing the practices, but at my job, I was using SaaS. Like I just didn't have a lot of practical applications for it. So I knew enough Python to like fumble my way around. And obviously I got through the tech screening, but it was not easy. And so I had that initial tech screening, and then I had 4 hours. I was called back maybe a month later for 4 hours of back-to-back interviews.
Yeah,
with,
the gauntlet
I think it was
day.
with 4 or 5. Yeah, It was with like 4 or 5 different people all afternoon. And I had there were like 2 or 3 of those interviews were again the tech screenings with the screen sharing, and then I had kind of the more like culture fit person.
Mm-hmm. And soup to nuts, how long did the process take?
Like from that first initial recruiter to hire date?
Yeah, submit the application through, got a job offer.
Yeah, I would say like 8 weeks.
Okay, right on. Not that bad.
Yeah, it took which I thought felt like a while, but I know my recruiter had like some personal issues in the middle, so there was some dead space in the middle there. But yeah, it felt long, but ultimately got the offer.
Right on. And you started in a different role than you're in now. What was the journey like? So you started in one role. What was that like? And then how did you transition into the team that you're in now?
So I got reorged within the same org, but so it's kind of still the same team. So I got hired on to be in that search A/B experimentation role. So essentially, I mentioned earlier that we work on kind of optimizing search, for lack of a better term, kind of making that search process better. To do that, we run A/B experiments. And that's, again, pretty typical of a lot of tech companies do that. A lot of any kind of company does it. I've heard a lot about HelloFresh, and they do a lot of A/B experimentation. So we do a lot of, we will either add a feature or take away a feature, test it for a couple weeks, kind of see how users react. And that can be as simple as like changing a color, or it can be adding a button, or it can be increasing or decreasing the number of search results you're seeing, like kind of changing all of those different kinds of things and seeing how users react. And we get back a series of numbers about what users are doing. So things about clicks and hovers and time spent on pages. And we can look at that to see, is the impact good? Is the impact bad? And so my team's responsibility is kind of interpreting those numbers and helping those feature teams to say, yes, this is a good feature. We think you should ship it. No, we don't think it's a great feature. We think you should kind of investigate a little more and figure out why users don't love it before you go further.
How interesting. So tell us a little bit about how you work on the search relevance side of things. And then would you educate us a little bit about search relevance and CoPilot?
A lot of I kind of have two hats nowadays. So there is still the search relevance A/B experimentation part of it, where we're still trying to improve search. And a lot of that too is internally educating those experimentation teams, the ones that are creating those features and implementing those features, about experimentation best practices, making sure that when you make changes, you're making one change at a time, not three. Because if you make three, then you really don't know. If you make three and there's a positive outcome, you don't know which one that caused that positive outcome because you changed three things. And so if you change the color and the shape and the size of the button, we don't know which one users are reacting to. So we really try to encourage people to change one thing at a time, be very systematic about it. We try to talk to people about different types of metrics and why a metric might move in one direction and not another. And so there's a lot of I've done a lot of like document writing and just educating about that whole experimentation process. I am still in the same org that I was hired into. I have a different manager these days, but that was just a reorg that now we kind of focus. So search relevance is one of many organizations at Microsoft that have been pulled into this CoPilot effort to try and make it better. So we are approaching it from still the search side, that like when you're interacting with CoPilot, there's a search component that you're trying to find a document or trying to find a person, and we can see kind of how that works on the back end. Again, we can't see anything specific. I can't see what you typed. I can't see what was returned, but we can kind of make those same deductions.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you can teach us about perhaps using CoPilot better, or anything that you've learned about how AI might work, or anything that would just be an interesting tidbit for us to take away from, your in-depth experience?
It's a lot of trial and error. I mean, I know like prompt engineering is a big keyword right now, and trying to figure out how to talk to it. And I know I've had plenty of frustrating conversations with CoPilot where it's like, that's not what I meant, but I can see why you interpreted it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a little bit of back and forth, like, no, I mean, I've learned like talk to it like a human, and that's like the best way to kind of get what you're looking for.
Sure. Interesting. That makes a lot of sense. And I imagine talk to it like a human, because that's how the model was trained, right? On humans talking to humans.
Exactly.
We'll get back to the conversation shortly, but I wanted to tell you about how I can help you find your fit. I offer one-on-one career coaching services for experienced professionals who are preparing to find and land their next role. If you're a director, vice president, or a C-suite executive, and you're ready to explore new opportunities, please go to goodfitcareers.com to apply for a free consultation. I also occasionally send a newsletter which includes stories from professionals who have found their fit, strategies and insights that might be helpful in your job search, and content that I found particularly useful or interesting. If you'd like to learn more, check out goodfitcareers.com and follow me on LinkedIn. Now, back to the conversation. Working for a company like Microsoft, one of the most valuable companies in the world, kind of the very top of the Fortune 500 list, I mean, kind of the darling of the technology world for like the last 30 years. What is it actually like working there? And perhaps what were your expectations going in, and what has it actually been like?
I'll be honest that I did not ask enough questions during the interview process. So I did not have a lot of expectations. I didn't know what to expect. I went from, like I said, like relatively small publicly traded company to relatively small private company to massive publicly traded company, which was like a pretty big transition. Working from home, I think I know my experience would have been different if I wasn't working from home. You know, I've been to Microsoft's campus, and it's bigger than a lot of college campuses. So I think that part would have been a little bit more overwhelming. But I don't know if I expected the caliber of people that I work with. Like I've worked with a lot of smart people over the years. Microsoft employees are consistently some of the smartest and hardworking people I've ever worked with. Like I have to remind myself of what I said, that if you're not uncomfortable, you're not growing. That like I asked for this discomfort. Like I wanted to be uncomfortable on a daily basis. I did this to myself, and I asked for it, and it's good for me. So I have to remind myself. I have to remind myself of that a lot when I have that imposter syndrome creeping in. You know, that it just I wanted this, and I am learning and growing every day.
How exciting. I feel like the moment of knowing that you're not the smartest person in the room can be both terrifying, and then for me, something that's like, yes, I get to learn from these people. This is so fascinating. But also I have to remember that like they're way smarter than me. That's okay.
Yeah. I would love if there was like one day that I felt like the smartest person in the room, but it's pretty rare. Microsoft.
I bet your day in the sun will come.
Someday.
So let's talk a little bit about what we can teach our listeners here. You've got a super cool background. You've worked at some really interesting companies. And I think the depth of your expertise is something that I'd love to learn a little bit more about. If you were teaching someone how to, be on your team or training someone to do your job, is there something that you could teach us that we might be able to take away, and have your shining moment in the sun of being the smartest person in the room here?
So data science is a relatively new term. I know when I was in grad school, it really wasn't. Like I called myself a statistician, not a data scientist. And they were two very different things. Now I think they've kind of merged. There are different flavors of it, which is something I've learned in the last few years, that, there are those more data scientists that focus more on coding and programming and model building and the LLMs and that kind of like, there is that flavor of data scientist that really wants to like dig around in the models. Like I've done with my whole career and in grad school, I've always wanted to be more on that applied side that's like using it and not digging around in it. Like I'll dig a little bit, but then I want to go do stuff with it. So in my experience, and I think I've mentioned, having that communication skill is really something that I've told a lot of people to focus on who ask me for advice on how to be a data scientist. It's like, you can build the coolest model or the coolest chart or the coolest thing. And if you can't explain it, then it's not really worth the paper it's on. The other part of that is, and I know there are some of these like crash course data science programs that you can take and you can learn, and they're great. I think the thing that a lot of them leave out is the why part. And so if you're doing like an A/B experiment, or you want to run a t-test, I mean, like t-tests are what you run in an A/B experiment. But do you know why? Like, do you know why you're running that test? Do you know why you're creating, like I said, with the pie chart? Like, if you have a bunch of things that don't add up to 100%, don't make a pie chart. Like, but know why you're not making a pie chart. So there's sometimes that why that's missing, of like being able to explain the decisions you're making as a data scientist and not just going through the motions,
Why would one use a t-test? And maybe let's get a little bit deeper on, how to go about taking an A/B experiment. We've already learned from you that we need to change one thing at a time so we don't get false positives on what that change yielded. But teach us a little bit about what a t-test is. Teach us about how we might use that in an A/B test. And if anybody's out there who's trying to make their own product better or their own product experience better, how would they start to think about, like, what do I change first? What do I experiment with?
So t-test is measuring the difference between two populations. So in a really simple A/B experiment, you have a treatment population where you've given them the different color button, and then the control population where they've got the same button that they had before. And so they don't know that anything's different. They don't know they're being experimented on. And so you kind of run that experiment for a week or 2 weeks. We recommend a week just to even out those like weekday, weekend, because people aren't using Teams as much on the weekends, so you kind of want to even out, right? I try not to even out those patterns. So you want kind of a consistent pattern for what users are doing, and then you can gather a bunch of numbers at the end and then calculate those differences between the two populations. But t-tests inherently have underlying assumptions. You have assumptions about the populations, that they're similar, that they're distributed similarly, things like that. So you kind of need to know those assumptions so you don't run a different kind of test on them just because you think it's quicker or faster or cheaper or whatever. But like you got to run the right kind of test based on the data that you have. One of the things I learned in grad school was about they're called non-parametric tests. So that's like for populations where they don't have those underlying assumptions, you can run those different kind of tests. But just like with a t-test, it's got its own set of assumptions that you need to pay attention to, that you need to know about. And so, like I said, with anything you choose to do, there's that underlying why, that like you need to make sure you're making the right choices based on the data that you have.
Cool. Right on. In terms of projects and kind of digging deeper here for our fellow nerds, can you tell us a little bit about client engagement scoring and lead scoring with SaaS, what that was all about?
Yeah, that was something I kind of fell into as part of a reorg into marketing sciences, where we were using models, and there were different kinds of models to predict whether a person was a good sales lead. And so we could use all these different facets about a person. We were running these models every day, and then it would kind of spit out like these are a bunch of different leads, and then we would give them to salespeople to call. Obviously, it's different than like a real, like somebody who filled out a form on a website. Like that's a different kind of lead, but these are like using scoring models to kind of figure out if somebody would be a good potential lead. So a lot of my job I wasn't the model builder. I was kind of the liaison between the team that did the model building and then the sales and business people, and kind of explaining to them why they should care about these scored leads. So it was a lot of that communication, that just like explaining to them, like, this is what a scored lead means. This is why it's not garbage. It's not random. It's not just like a person we pulled out of the system. Like they did these things, we can list them out for you. And based on the scores that are assigned to them, we think that they would be a good candidate. So you should pick up the phone. And it was a lot of explaining that. I would get a lot of like, I got this lead, why? And like, I could go in and look for it, but or you could just pick up the phone and talk to that person about what they've been doing.
That's so scary. I don't know about that.
Right. I know. That's not what I want to do, but I'm just telling you should do it. So, but
that's awesome. That makes a lot of sense.
It was an interesting role. Yeah.
And just to kind of close that project out, any big surprises, any lessons learned, or any specific tactical takeaways that anybody might, if they're thinking about how to, their own engagement with their business or scoring their own leads, anything they might be able to learn from you on that?
I didn't anticipate how much we would need to like tune it all the time. Like that was my first experience with like a model that does scoring since grad school. Like we kind of talked about it in grad school, but I hadn't done it in practice. But it was something we were kind of always adjusting, always fine tuning based on feedback from the team. If they were getting a bunch of leads that really weren't super useful, like they would call them and it wasn't a useful lead, we could kind of tune it, and you could turn different categories on and off based on whether you wanted to feature that.
Okay.
So
that's what tuning means, essentially like adjusting what is being asked or what you're looking at?
So tuning could mean two things. You could be taking categories out, like maybe you're taking out, like this is an extreme example, but like what they're doing on the website. Like you could take that out of the model and that's not being considered anymore. Or it's changing the coefficients. So how much is that weighted versus clicking on an email or responding to a survey or, those kinds of things. Like, so those could be weighted more heavily, and you could change those weights based on how much you want to focus on those activities.
How interesting. That's awesome. When thinking about broader perceptions, misconceptions that people might have, how do you believe the world sees both your job and also how, they would see your job at Microsoft?
So I mentioned the two that I think I described two flavors of data scientists. I think there's a lot, there's kind of, we're on a spectrum, but I think a lot of people see data scientists as those model builders, those ones that are working with LLMs that are really building models. I mean, for lack of a better term, they're kind of building models, fine tuning models. And I know people at Microsoft that work with GPT-3 and GPT-4 and kind of build their own models off of those and like do all kinds of cool stuff. And I think that's what a lot of people think of as a data scientist, that they're just, they know all of these different programming languages. They're experts in Python and Linux and C# and can code their way out of a paper bag. And then there's those of us that know enough coding to do what we need to do. But, I kind of code so I can get the stuff so I can go do things with it. And I think that's, not to keep saying the same phrase, but like that's always been kind of my get the data and then go do things with it and kind of apply it and make it useful and find those insights, make those dashboards. I mean, I remember like building my first like really in-depth dashboard at SAS and realizing like, this is like, I used to think of dashboards as like, I'm telling people to do my job for me and I'm just putting all this data in a dashboard and then they can go do it. And but it's not. Like you kind of have to, I'm always iterating on the dashboard. I've had multiple, like at my job at Microsoft, I maintain a dashboard about CoPilot. I've had multiple meetings walking people through it, walking groups through it. Like, this is how you use it. This is what you do with it. Like give me feedback if there are charts and graphs that you like or don't see on here that I can add. And so it's much more of a window into, you can self-serve, but I have to put it in a way that allows you to self-serve. Like it's an art, it's a bit of an art and a science. So there is that part of data science too. That's like democratizing the data, I guess would be the word, where I'm kind of making it accessible.
Interesting. And just in case people out there don't know what a dashboard is, as far as I understand this is like the dashboard on your car where you have dials and gauges that'll tell you kind of how things are going, the health of or performance of whatever you're looking at. Is that about right?
Right. Yeah. And I feel like they became more of a household term during COVID, where you could go on and you could see like the World Health Organization's dashboard or whatever. And so, yeah, it's charts and graphs, it's maps. It is a little bit of an art where I feel like every dashboard builder does it a little bit differently, and you can have kind of the same thing shown in different ways. But it's a lot of what I was talking about earlier, like knowing the difference between when to put a line graph and when to put a bar chart and when to, how to present things in a way that's useful, that allows, I think the key is to allow people to like take a look at it and get a nugget from it, or dig deeper and get, more of those hidden pieces of information.
Interesting. So practical data visualization in said a different way. Okay, right on. When you're thinking about the folks out there who might want to grow into data science or switch careers and join the field, how would you help them set some reasonable expectations on what it might be like, and perhaps help them think through how they might succeed as they begin, that journey into this new field?
I think knowing a coding language is obviously the top thing you need to do. Like if you're going from a non-tech, you're taking the extreme example of going from like a non-tech background into data science, having that Python would be the one that I would choose, but you're having that knowledge of how to use it and what to do with it and when to do things, when to use it for what types of things, like is really the most invaluable skill. You can get a long way with those LLMs nowadays. So I've definitely used
further
it
every day.
Yeah, I have definitely used it when I get stuck on a particular piece of code. But like I keep harping on, having that ability to explain what you're doing and having the ability to talk to people from bottom to top. Like I've had presentations, not at Microsoft, but I've had presentations in front of C-level executives where I need to be able to explain what I'm talking about. And I need to be able to tell them quickly, what I did, what I found, why they should care, what they should do with it. And, let me know if you have questions. Like you have to be able to do those to communicate.
And I take away from that both a lot of hope for people out there who may not necessarily be deep in the weeds, building the models, right, doing the hardcore theoretical math. But if they still want to be in data science or statistics or analysis of any sort, that if you're articulate and you can understand what you're seeing and then help make that simple enough and tangible enough for marketers or the product managers or anybody else, that, there's still hope. There's a place for everyone like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the difference there that I've seen among the people that try to get there quickly is that why. that why would you choose that chart? Why would you choose that statistical test? Like you need to know the why.
Mm-hmm. And I also think that if folks are out there listening and they can kind of hear some of themselves in the way you're describing your story here, that being able to stick with that thread of, I wanted to be able to use math. I was good at math, but I wanted to be able to use it practically. And, I'm now proficient at coding, but it was much easier for me to learn when I was using it every day. And pulling on that thread or being able to kind of lean into that natural tendency, it sounds like it's been a real positive, a plus for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the big things I've learned too is that even small things can be big wins. Going through grad school, and I remember a few years after I finished grad school and I was working, my parents would ask, are you using any of what you learned in grad school? And most of the time the answer was no. I really wasn't. I was learning what I learned in undergrad, but I had more of that why foundation, more of why would you choose that test or chart. There was more depth. I have had moments throughout my career where I put data in a particular visualization and it was like, whoa, I never looked at it that way. I never thought about it that way. And I'm like, that's just a line chart, I'm sitting there but to an executive who has 30 seconds and sees that really positive correlation and is like, wow, if we just do this, then this happens, it took me 5 minutes, but it's a win.
Just because it's easy for you doesn't mean it's easy for everyone else.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So it can be rewarding in that way.
Beautiful. If you're thinking about going back in time and perhaps giving your younger self any advice now that you are where you are, you seem very happy in your role. You seem like you found a really good fit. What advice would you share with your younger self?
I mean, I certainly don't think I would do anything differently if I could go back. I think jobs and working is like dating, where you have to it's a journey of finding what you don't like in order to find what you do. And so I've had a few of those jobs where I knew I didn't like it. I remember my dad giving me the 7 habits of highly effective people, or my mom gave me
classic dad move.
Yeah. I read a book that was literally called Dealing with Difficult People, because I had a really difficult manager at one point in my career. And I think that that people part of it is the key. You got to be able to work with people and communicate with people and work with a lot of different types of people that are very different than you. But you have to keep in mind that you're all doing a job, everybody's got lives at home. And yeah, I guess that's probably what I would say is focusing on those interpersonal relationships is important, especially working from home. It's a lot harder. So.
Oh, no kidding. What do you think your 20-year-old self or so would have done with that advice and saying that, hey, you really need to be good with all the people. They've got all this kind of different stuff going on. Have that level of empathy with them. How do you think you would have received that advice and what do you think you would have done with it?
I probably would have put my foot in my mouth even more than I did. I would have done even more of those conversations that I had at Kangaroo. And I think I've always been the shy person. So maybe I would have put myself out there more and kind of had more of those awkward conversations. But
right on.
All for the greater good, right?
Sure. Totally. That's great. So you were good at math when you were a kid. Did you end up at this point, and you've got a long way to go in your career, but did you end up being what you thought you would be when you were a kid or vice versa?
I didn't know this was a job when I was a kid. And really I was going to say, I don't think data scientist was a term because it was really new when I was in grad school back in the 2010s. So I don't think I wanted to be an FBI agent. So no, I did not end up where I wanted to be.
Fair enough.
But so that's where, I had a lot of different career paths because I just didn't know what one would do with math when I was in 5th, 6th, 7th grade. It was you could teach, but then I didn't really know what else you would do. And I knew I didn't want to be a teacher because I've never been great at explaining things.
Huh. Well, you seem pretty good at it now.
Thanks.
I didn't know that you wanted to be an FBI agent. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I mean, I think I grew up in that, true crime, and still, I listen to the podcasts and all of that. So I think I grew up in that Law and Order and CSI generation where it just looked really cool that it was that. And I guess not to be too philosophical, but it was that problem solving. It was that just like, we have a problem, we need to solve it. We do all these things. And, I kind of do that now with data, with, I'm problem solving with data. It's at a tech company and it's for, profits and things. But yeah, it's that same vibe, just less death.
Less death. Perfect. That sounds way more fun.
Yeah. Right.
Do you have a favorite true crime podcast that you might want to recommend for the folks out there?
I mean, I love Crime Junkie. Like
Crime Junkie.
It's always the number one. Yeah, it's a really good one. Morbid's another good one. Yeah. So
right on. When you're thinking about hiring, we all have a different relationship with hiring. We all have different levels of responsibility when it comes down to it. At this point in your career, do you do much hiring? And perhaps walk us through how you see hiring if you're involved in it.
So I haven't done it at Microsoft. I don't have much experience with it, aside from being on the hired side of it. I don't have much experience with that process, but I did sit on a couple of interview panels when I was at SAS, and I interviewed people for the teams that I was on there. I feel like every interview it's tough because I feel like every interview is really different. And my experience was that like every person had something that it was like, well, we're missing that, we need it. But then another person would have a different thing that, well, we're missing that too. And so I think I don't envy people who make those ultimate hiring decisions because it's tough. Like there's always I feel like every time we hired somebody, there were multiple candidates that ended up being really great. And then you'd pick one. And I know one experience I had, we picked wrong, and like it just, we kind of had to live with that and take care of it and figure it out. But I always looked more for like, I feel like I sound like a broken record, but the communication part. The like, if you can't talk, if you can't convey your ideas, if you can't look me in the eye when you're talking about what you're talking about, then like you can't, like some of that stuff you can't teach. You can't. It's a little bit innate. It's a little bit like your ability to talk to me about something that, even if you're explaining what you did over the weekend, like if you can't explain it in a way that makes sense to me, then, I don't know if I can help you.
Makes a lot of sense. You've been hired several times. You've been promoted several times. Are there any parts of the interview process that in general you dislike or dread or wish weren't there or feel like they're not necessary or useful?
Every interview I've ever had has been very different. I don't remember a lot of my kangaroo interviews, but I remember my SAS interview. It was a series of like lunches. Like I had lunch with a bunch of different people. Like it was one person at a time because I was working at Kangaroo and I happened to be at SAS for a training class that on campus. And so it was like, this is perfect timing. I'll interview for this job. And so every day at lunch, I'd have lunch with a different person and just kind of have an interview. And it was easy. There was no tech screening. There was no presentation. It was just a bunch of lunches and coffees. And it was great. It was like just kind of getting to know people and figuring out if I would be a good fit for the team. And I can obviously see the value in tech screenings and in making sure that people know how to do the thing they're being hired to do. I miss that simplicity of it, Yeah,
it's a different world these days. I don't know if this is going to be something that you'll be able to answer, but when you're thinking about folks who might want to join Microsoft or might want to get into data science, is there anything that you could perhaps imagine on their resume or their LinkedIn profile or how they connect with you that might compel you to take a chance on somebody out there?
I get this question a lot, and a lot of times I get a lot of like cold emails and cold messages on LinkedIn for can I talk to you about how my job aligns or how my experience aligns. And I think there's a randomness to it, especially at a large company like Microsoft. It's just kind of right person, right time. And I think that's probably true for me as well, that it just happened to be the right person took a look at my resume and the right person looked at the email I sent. So I think there is a randomness to it that nothing I can say guarantees that you'll get in. And I think people are looking for that like magic bullet. I've had the opportunity to mentor some people recently where they've asked me these same questions, and it's more of a relationship that I can work with them and I can look at their resume. And I'll go back to the same thing I've said repeatedly. It's like you can have 16 programming languages on there and you're really good at all of them, and you can give me code samples and you can code side by side and you can do all of that. But if there's nothing on there to indicate that you have the ability to talk, then I feel like you're missing something. I feel like if you're not, even if it's being part of organizations, or like I've always, starting at SAS and through at Microsoft, I try and do, I guess, extracurriculars. I've always tried to be involved in the women's ERG, employee resource group. And so I get involved, and I am on the board, and I kind of can do those different things. So I think having stuff like that, where it indicates that you have interests outside of just your computer, Yeah. So I think soft skills are dismissed a lot of times. And so I think making sure that you have examples of those.
How do you like to be reached out to? If somebody's going to cold reach out, or perhaps how do you not like to be reached out to?
I actually don't mind the reaching out on LinkedIn. I do mind. I've had a couple where it's like, can you refer me to this job? And it's like, if I don't know you, I'm not going to do that. Like we need to have a little bit more of a conversation before I refer you to a job. And so I don't love that. But I've had a few people reach out to me on LinkedIn that just say, can I schedule a 15-minute call with you where we just kind of like talk about my career aspirations and you can give me some advice. And I've had a few people where I've agreed to do that, and it was great. And, so I think I'm at a point in my career that I unfortunately have never, like, I've had mentors over the years. I don't have like a consistent mentor that I've always worked with, but I've always had people that I could reach out to, that I could ask questions and I could get guidance from. And I still have those couple of people. So because of that, I had never really thought of myself as a mentor person, like a mentor person. But I think I do have a lot of experience at this point. I mean, I've been in the workforce for 15 years or so, and I think I know a little bit about working. So, I'm happy to answer questions. It just has to be presented in a way that's like they want to learn and not just get a job. I think those are the ones that frustrate me, when it's just like, how do I get a job? And it's like, well, I can't answer that. I can look at your resume and I can give you some pointers, but I can't tell you how to get a job at Microsoft. It's just, it's a little bit random.
Sure. And I hope that and maybe you do, maybe you don't, but I imagine the people here who are listening to this do find your story very inspiring. And I think that, whether you see yourself as a mentor or not, the information that you've shared so far, I think, is going to be very helpful for people out there. So thank you in advance for taking the time to share all this. And I just wanted to take a moment to, let you know that I think you're maybe more of a mentor than you give yourself credit for.
I appreciate that. Yeah. And I'm happy to give that kind of guidance, because I think some of it is stuff that I wish somebody would have told me earlier on. I wish somebody would have, I've kind of realized over the years that how important communication is, but I don't think anybody really talked about it.
Yeah, totally. As we bring this conversation to a close, I want to switch our focus to the future. And we can talk about the future of your work. We can talk about the future of business, future of the world in general, whatever you're excited about. But what are you excited about for the future?
I'm really curious to see how AI enhances life. I mean, I think we keep seeing the two ends of the spectrum, right? Like we keep seeing these really cool, like, AI can do this, and then we see the like major flubs, and it's like, ooh, AI is not perfect, and so I feel like we keep oscillating back and forth between those two, like, it's great, it's not great, I think there's a middle ground where it can, I mean, you and I, it sounds like we've both used it to enhance our job and answer questions and help me code and things like that. Like, I think there's space for it. Maybe naively, I don't worry about it replacing me, because I think there's still the why. Like I've said, I think there's still the need to know, if you ask CoPilot to do a specific thing, you need to be able to explain it. Like, somebody needs to be able to explain it. You can't just like spit stuff out and publish it. Like, there still needs to be some oversight, I think. And I don't see that going away anytime soon, but I'm certainly not an expert on it.
Sure.
By any means.
Right on. I'm so curious to see how it goes as well. I mean, just seeing the leap from GPT-3 to 3.5 to 4 and now 4 Turbo. I mean, it's just incredible. And I'm so excited to see what happens. I think I don't know. I'm not as afraid of it in the sense that it seems like another tool. It seems like a very sophisticated tool, but it still feels like a tool and not yet like a full colleague or sentient anything.
Agreed. Yeah, and I think that, we keep seeing that with creating collateral, like photos and videos, and like it can create things, but it's not gonna, I don't think it's ever gonna, well, I shouldn't say never, because who the heck knows? But, I don't see it replacing, film directors and things like that. Like, it's just not, I don't really want to watch an AI movie. I'd rather have, the people,
Yeah, totally. When we're thinking about what we might want to recommend, whether it's books or podcasts or promoting anything that you're working on, promoting any of the things you're excited about, sharing anything that might be valuable with the folks out there, do you have any closing thoughts?
I've gotten more into, so I have the privilege of working at Microsoft that I can use LinkedIn Learning for free. And so I do a lot of just like random classes on LinkedIn Learning. And I've also gotten really into Medium, like reading articles on Medium.
Yeah, long form. Sure.
So I think, between the two, I've learned a lot in just random thing. I just watched a LinkedIn Learning video last month about decision science and like what that field means and like how to make good decisions. And it's like, I never really thought about it in that much depth, but I learned a lot. So, and same thing with Medium. Like you can read these more in-depth articles about really specific things that I never would have asked a question about, but somebody decided to write an article and it's really interesting. That's where I learned about HelloFresh doing A/B experimentation. So I have had, it's ebbed and flowed throughout my career, that whole like lifelong learner thing. And there have been times where I've been more committed to it than others, but I'm trying to make sure that I'm learning as much as I can about the field, especially it moves so fast that, you can learn something today and it's irrelevant tomorrow. But, trying to kind of stay informed, I think is important. Yeah.
Tremendous. I love it. Jennifer, thank you so much for taking the time to share your perspective. This was so interesting and so valuable. I'm so grateful that you took the time. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Our next episode is with Matt McDonald, Executive Vice President and Director of Strategy and Communications at Leo Burnett.
I think the big thing I would tell people is to go for it, to not doubt themselves, go after anything that they really think they want to do.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe for new episodes, leave a review, and tell a friend. Good Fit Careers is hosted by me, Ryan Dickerson, and is produced and edited by Mellow Vox Productions. Marketing is by Story Angled, and our theme music is by Surftronica, with additional music from Andrew Esperanceta. I'd like to express my gratitude to all of our guests for sharing their time, stories, and perspectives with us. And finally, thank you to all of our listeners. If you have any recommendations on future guests, questions, or comments, please send us an email at hello@goodfitcareers.com.